In the clinical reconstruction of R&B history, the year 1991 is often recorded as a high-frequency peak. The airwaves were saturated with the kinetic energy of New Jack Swing, a period where the grit of hip-hop was being systematically fused with the harmonic sophistication of soul. It was a year of global dominance for megastars like Michael Jackson and Color Me Bad. But beneath the high-decibel marketing of the era, a specific sonic foundation was being laid by a duo that most modern audits have overlooked, Dee Dee and Damian Dame. To analyze Dee Dee and Damian is to confront a redacted legacy. In a genre that thrives on reunions, documentaries, and digital immortality, their story remains a jagged fragment, a narrative abruptly disconnected from its future. They did not experience the slow, predictable decay of relevance or the gradual erosion of a public fallout. Instead, their trajectory was subject to a catastrophic double interruption. In the forensics of fame, we rarely encounter a timeline so symmetrical in its tragedy. Two partners, 2 years apart, silenced on the exact same day of the calendar. Their sound was an anomaly in a landscape of flash and gimmick. While their peers were chasing neon-lit spectacles and over-choreographed personas, Dee Dee and Damian offered a grounded frequency. They didn't scream for attention. They commanded it through a specific brand of rhythmic honesty. Dee Dee brought the seasoned perspective of a woman who had already navigated the predatory politics of the 1,980 seconds, while Damian provided the raw, multi-instrumental edge of a young prodigy. Together, they became the inaugural act for LaFace Records, the laboratory where Reid and Babyface would eventually build an empire. However, the forensic question that hangs over their file is simple. How does a duo that scored a Hashone R&B hit and defined the early template of a legendary label disappear so completely from the collective memory? The industry is built on the accumulation of data awards, follow-up albums, and legacy tours. But for Dee Dee and Damian, the data stream was cut off before the world could even process the first act. The audit reveals that their story was cut in half by a series of events that defy typical industry logic. Dee Dee Dane was a woman whose voice had survived the cold casting rooms of the 1,980 seconds and a short-lived solo career at Geffen Records, only to be taken by a sudden structural failure on an Atlanta highway. She was the anchor, the voice of survival, and the mentor within the duo. When she was gone in 1994, the duo ceased to exist as a biological and creative unit, leaving Damian to navigate the vacuum of the industry alone. Damian Dame, the young architect who helped shape the sound behind the scenes as a multi-instrumentalist and producer, was given only 2 more years to tell his side of the narrative. In a cruel twist of mathematical irony, he was claimed by illness exactly 2 years to the day after Dee Dee's passing. The symmetry of their deaths, the 27th of June 1994 and the 27th of June 1996, acts as a double redaction. It was as if the universe had decided to strike through their names twice, ensuring that no second album, no reunion tour, and no elder statesman reflection would ever occur to explain their impact. This documentary audit is not a rehearsal of simple nostalgia. It is an investigation into interrupted brilliance. We are looking for the static in the records they left behind, the unfinished melodies and the unspoken frustrations of 2 artists who were working inside a corporate machine that was growing too large and too fast to protect them. Dee Dee and Damian Dame were not chasing superstardom in the traditional sense. They were building an honest frequency between genres. Their music didn't demand the spotlight. It waited for listeners to meet it halfway. As we open this file, we move past the charts and the platinum dreams to find the human beings trapped in a cycle of rapid momentum followed by absolute tragedy. We are here to listen for the presence that remains in the silence, to recover a sound that was erased before it could become a tradition. The audit begins now. To audit the career of Dee Dee Dane is to examine the survival of a voice in an era designed to commodify and discard it. Born on the 20th of September 1958 in Houston and raised in the cultural sprawl of San Jose, Dee Dee was not a product of the instant fame machinery. Her vocal development followed a traditional, rigorous path rooted in the discipline of the church choir and refined in the brutal honesty of live performance. Long before she became one half of a LaFace duo, She was a solo architect, navigating an industry that often mistook her restraint for a lack of ambition. In 1983, the Audit records her first major systemic entry, a self-titled debut album with Geffen Records. At 25, Dee Dee was already a seasoned vocalist. The album was a sophisticated blend of R&B and early 80 seconds pop, featuring tracks like Hug Me, Squeeze Me, and a cover of Prince's Got a Broken Heart Again. While the Prince cover reached number 62 on the Billboard Hot Black Singles chart, the overall project failed to achieve the market saturation required by a major label like Geffen. The forensic data of this period shows a familiar industry pattern: a talented artist signed, a record released with moderate local success, and a subsequent withdrawal of promotional capital. In the eyes of the corporate auditors, Dee Dee was a mid-tier performer. But for Dee Dee, the failure of the Geffen deal was not a liquidation, it was a pivot. Instead of retreating, she transitioned into the high-intensity world of session work and background vocals. This phase of her career is a testament to her vocal infrastructure. She possessed a voice that could provide essential texture without overwhelming the lead. This capability caught the attention of The Deal, a group from Cincinnati that included two young visionaries, Antonio L.A. Reid and Kenny Babyface Edmonds. Dee Dee became a silent partner in the early evolution of the LaFace sound. She provided background vocals for Babyface's debut solo album, Lovers 1986, specifically on the track Faithful. She was the invisible frequency in the room as Reid and Edmonds began to refine their production style. To audit her contributions during the late 80 seconds is to see her name scattered across the liner notes of the era's biggest hits, Karen White, Pebbles, and Shalimar. She was learning the industrial mechanics of hitmaking from the inside. She watched as artists were packaged, branded, and launched. She understood that while the lead singer took the glory, the real power lived behind the mixing board. This exposure hardened her professional resolve. She wasn't just a singer anymore. She was a technician of sound, waiting for the right structural moment to step back into the foreground. That moment arrived through a demo tape and a young producer named Damian. The audit of their first meeting reveals a perfect tonal alignment. Damian was looking for a vocalist with maturity, someone who could ground his electronic, hip-hop-inflected rhythms with traditional soul discipline. Dee Dee, conversely, was looking for a contemporary edge to revitalize her seasoned sound. Initially, the project was intended to be a solo vehicle for Dee Dee, produced by Damian. However, during the sessions, the biological chemistry of their combined voices created a frequency that neither could achieve alone. Dee Dee, recognizing Damian's untapped vocal potential, pushed him from the control room to the microphone. When they presented their demos to Babyface and L.A. Reid, the response was immediate. The producers didn't just hear a singer and a producer. They heard a duo. They saw a bridge between the classic soul era and the emerging New Jack Swing movement. For Dee Dee, signing to the newly formed LaFace Records was a moment of hard-won redemption. She had survived the collapse of her Geffen deal, survived the invisibility of the background vocal circuit, and survived a decade of industry indifference. At 32, she was the veteran anchor of the label's first flagship act. She brought the stone to Damian's fire. But as the forensic timeline prepares to shift into the 1,990 seconds, the audit reveals a looming pressure. They were no longer independent artists. They were the primary test case for a new corporate empire. The foundation was set, the contracts were signed, but the machine was about to accelerate to a speed that would test every structural joint of the duo's partnership. In the clinical study of musical prodigies, the case of Damian Sneed on the 13th of September 1966, represents a rare total system integration. While many artists are born with a singular talent, be it vocal or instrumental, Damian was born with a comprehensive understanding of sonic architecture. Growing up in Battle Creek, Michigan, his development did not follow the standard trajectory of practice and gradual improvement. Instead, it was an immediate, intuitive absorption of complex musical data. By the age of 9, Damian had already mastered the piano, drums, and guitar. To audit his childhood is to see a boy who did not just play instruments. He manipulated them to understand the physics of rhythm. He was heavily influenced by the controlled chaos of Michael Jackson and the multi-instrumental autonomy of Prince. These influences created a forensic blueprint in his mind. The realization that the most powerful music is that which is built from the ground up by a single visionary mind. As a teenager, Damian transitioned from local Michigan clubs to the high-voltage environment of Los Angeles. He didn't arrive as a singer seeking fame. He arrived as a technician seeking a console. Joining the group Shy Boy as a keyboardist provided him with his first major industry audit. He wasn't interested in the spotlight. He was interested in the signal path. He spent his time observing how sound was captured, compressed, and layered. This technical obsession led to the formation of his own production company, Kazoo. Damian's approach to production was clinical. He didn't believe in happy accidents. Every kick drum, every snare hit, and every synthesizer pad was placed with a specific frequency-based intent. He was a student of arrangement and space, understanding that what you leave out of a record is often more important than what you put in. When Damian first heard Dee Dee's demo, his interest was purely professional. He didn't hear a star. He heard a primary frequency that was missing from his electronic soundscapes. He recognized that his rhythms, while technically perfect, lacked the organic grit that only a seasoned soul vocalist could provide. His initial intent was to remain behind the boards, the invisible architect directing a vocal powerhouse. However, the forensic record of their studio sessions reveals a fascinating systemic shift. As they worked together, the boundary between producer and artist began to blur. Dee Dee, with her decade of industry experience, conducted her own audit of Damian. She recognized that the young producer possessed a vocal tone that was raw, vulnerable, and perfectly matched to the sophisticated soul she brought to the table. She began to push him. She forced him to step away from the mixing console and stand in front of the microphone. Reluctantly, Damian began to sing. The audit of these early recordings shows a voice that wasn't polished by years of church training, but was instead characterized by a direct emotional connection. It was the digital meeting the analog. The duo of Dee Dee and Damian Dame was born out of this mutual structural reinforcement. Damian provided the rhythm, the structure, and the youthful edge. Dee Dee provided the emotional depth, the maturity, and the seasoned restraint. They were no longer two separate entities trying to make it. They were a singular, balanced system. When they presented their final demos to Babyface and L.A. Reid, the reaction was a validation of Damian's architectural vision. Reid, a drummer and producer himself, recognized the precision in Damian's arrangements. Babyface, the master of melody, heard the potential in the vocal interplay. By signing with LaFace Records, Damian had achieved the ultimate systemic upgrade. He was no longer a kid from Michigan with a dream. He was the technical co-pilot of the most exciting new label in America. But as the audit prepares to shift into their debut era, a new forensic variable emerges: the pressure of being first. They were the blueprint, the guinea pigs for an empire, and Damian was the one responsible for ensuring the foundation didn't crack under the weight of the massive expectations now resting on their shoulders. By the dawn of 1991, the forensic data surrounding the American R&B landscape indicated a total structural shift in consumer demand. The era of the overproduced, unreachable diva was being methodically replaced by a more accessible, rhythm-driven aesthetic that combined the grit of the street with the polish of the studio. LaFace Records, under the clinical guidance of L.A. Reid and Babyface, was positioned to be the primary architect of this new world order. As the first act officially signed to the label, Dee Dee and Damian Dame were not merely artists, they were a systemic statement. Their debut was the ultimate test case for whether the LaFace Blueprint could function as a standalone industrial machine outside of the producer's own group, The Deal. In April 1991, the label released the debut single, Exclusivity. To audit the success of this track is to understand the mechanical synergy of the early 90s. The song utilized a jagged, hip-hop-inflected drum pattern, a signature staple of the New Jack Swing movement, but layered it with a melodic sophistication that felt significantly more mature than its contemporaries. It was the industrial sound of the city meeting the analog warmth of the church. The market response was an immediate, resounding validation of the LaFace system. Exclusivity climbed with surgical precision to the #1 spot on the Billboard Hot R&B Singles chart, maintaining its position for 2 consecutive weeks. This was not a fluke. It was a calculated strike. The track also achieved significant cross-market penetration, peaking at number 42 on the Billboard Hot 100. This served as a critical forensic data point. It proved that Dee Dee and Damian's specific frequency could resonate with a mainstream multi-demographic audience without diluting its essential urban core. The self-titled debut album followed in May 1991, acting as a secondary audit of the duo's versatility. While the album's performance on the Billboard 200 was modest, its performance on the R&B albums chart revealed a peak at number 21, indicating deep loyalty within the genre's core listeners. More importantly, the album served as a collaborative node for the entire LaFace ecosystem. A forensic analysis of the liner notes and session data reveals the presence of a then-unknown trio from Atlanta, TLC. T-Boz and Left Eye provided guest vocals on the track 60 Seconds to Conclusion, while Chili appeared as a dancer in the duo's early promotional visual assets. At this stage, Dee Dee and Damian were the primary conductors of the label. They provided the platform through which future legends were first introduced to the public ear. They were the established infrastructure that supported the newcomers. Then came the recording that would provide the duo's permanent legacy marker, Right Down to It. This track represented a total departure from the aggressive, high BPM rhythms of their first single. It was a masterclass in vocal transparency. The arrangement was stripped back to its skeletal components, allowing the natural interplay between Dee Dee's seasoned, velvet restraint and Damian's raw, youthful sincerity to take center stage. The audit of Right Down to It shows an incredible durability index that few songs of that era could match. The song peaked at number 2 on the Billboard Hot R&B Singles chart and maintained a constant presence for over 20 weeks. It became a foundational staple of quiet storm radio, a frequency that demanded emotional honesty over vocal acrobatics. The track's structural integrity was so high that nearly a decade later, when covered by neo-soul artists like Kenny Lattimore, the original architectural blueprint remained virtually unchanged. It was a song built to withstand the erosion of time. However, the forensic record of late 1991 also reveals the subtle beginning of a focus shift within the corporate walls of the label. As LaFace Records expanded with a velocity that few anticipated, the industrial capacity of its founders began to be redistributed according to a new set of priorities. The massive, earth-shaking success of Bobby Brown's Don't Be Cruel, which L.A. Reid and Babyface had largely engineered along with the emergence of Toni Braxton and the full-scale launch of TLC, meant that the label's primary architects were being pulled in multiple high-stakes directions. Dee Dee and Damian, despite having delivered a #1 single and establishing a gold standard reputation for the label, began to experience the first signs of managerial friction. Their success had proven the LaFace concept, but now that the concept was proven, the machine was hungry for the next, even larger iteration of that success. The planning for their second album was discussed in meetings, but was not treated with the same clinical urgency as the debut projects of their label mates. The blueprint they had helped create was now being used to build much larger houses, and the duo was left standing on the very foundation they had poured, watching as the promotional resources and creative focus they had been promised were systematically diverted to the next market-disrupting sensation. They were at the absolute peak of their visibility, yet the forensic data suggests they were already becoming a secondary priority in the empire they had helped inaugurate. By 1992, the forensic data regarding LaFace Records indicated a shift from a boutique creative lab to a global production machine. The audit of this transition reveals a common industry phenomenon: the systemic neglect of foundational assets in favor of high-growth prospects. As L.A. Reid and Babyface became the primary architects for megastars like Toni Braxton and the explosive rise of TLC, the first act found themselves relegated to the periphery of the label's strategic planning. This phase marked the beginning of what would become a permanent structural displacement for Dee Dee and Damian Dame. The duo began to experience a communication redaction. While their records, specifically Right Down to It, were still achieving significant radio rotation and generating royalty data across urban markets, the internal reinvestment from the label had effectively stalled. The planning for their second studio album was characterized by a lack of clinical urgency. Meetings were consistently postponed, and promotional budgets were systematically redirected to newer, more market-elastic artists who promised a higher return on investment. The forensic record shows that the label's focus had transitioned from building artist longevity to maintaining a rapid-fire hit-making cycle. For Damian, who viewed himself as a technical collaborator and a multi-instrumental architect within the LaFace ecosystem, this shift was a profound structural disillusionment. He had contributed his skills and production instincts to the label's broader success during its infancy, yet he now found his own creative output being treated as a secondary priority. The forensic record of this period shows that Damian began to question the transparency of the corporate architecture he helped inhabit. Disputes regarding royalty distribution, publishing credits, and the overall management of their career trajectory began to surface behind closed doors. He was no longer just an artist. He was a litigant in waiting, fighting for the recognition of his labor. Dee Dee, with her decade of experience observing the boom and bust cycles of the industry, recognized the patterns of institutional atrophy. She understood that in the eyes of a rapidly expanding corporation, they were no longer the future. They were a proof of concept that had already served its purpose. Unlike many younger artists who might have reacted with public outbursts, Dee Dee's response was one of seasoned realism. She understood that their value was being liquidated by the very system they helped build. Despite this, the duo remained professional, continuing to record demos and explore new sonic directions that reflected their evolving artistic maturity. In 1992, their appearance on the Boomerang soundtrack with the track "Reversal of a Dog" served as a final piece of evidence regarding their status within the label. While the track was a significant commercial success and featured the entire LaFace roster, including TLC and Toni Braxton, it underscored a hierarchy of visibility. Dee Dee and Damian were part of the team, but they were no longer the captains. The track was a commercial victory for the label, but for the duo, it felt like a creative dilution. They were being used to bolster the branding of a compilation rather than being supported in their own individual growth. The audit of this period shows a growing acoustic silence between the artists and the executives. Damian reportedly became increasingly vocal about the lack of transparency in their contracts, a foreshadowing of the legal and financial battles that would later define the LaFace legacy for other artists like TLC. The duo began to look for exit strategies, exploring independent production opportunities and solo material that would allow them to reclaim their intellectual sovereignty. They were working harder than ever, performing at industry showcases and keeping their vocal precision sharp, but the machinery of momentum had left them behind. The second album remained a collection of unreleased demos, a phantom project that existed in the digital archives of LaFace, but never reached the physical pressing plant. They were trapped in a contractual limbo, still bound to a label that was no longer listening to their frequency. The forensic conclusion of this era is that Dee Dee and Damian Dame were the first victims of the label's own rapid success. They had built the house, but as the rooms filled with new stars, there was no longer a place for the architects at the table. They stood in the shadows of the platinum plaques they helped earn, waiting for a second chance that the industry was no longer prepared to give. In the forensics of human tragedy, we occasionally encounter data points that are so synchronized they defy the laws of simple probability. The story of Dee Dee and Damian Dame does not conclude with a slow fade into obscurity or a predictable decline in relevance. Instead, it reaches a point of total systemic termination through two distinct events, occurring exactly 2 years apart to the very day. This phenomenon acts as a double redaction of their legacy, leaving the industry and their audience in a state of permanent, unresolved silence. To audit these events is to confront the terrifying randomness of fate and the cold, unyielding nature of the calendar. The first catastrophic failure occurred on the 27th of June, 1994. Dee Dee Dane, the veteran anchor and the stone of the duo, was involved in a severe automotive accident in Atlanta, Georgia. The forensic audit of the crash reveals a violent structural breach that offered no margin for survival. At 35 years old, the woman who had survived the predatory politics of the 1,980 seconds, the cold rejection of major labels, and the invisibility of the background vocal circuit, was silenced by a sudden failure of physics on a highway. The loss was not merely professional, it was the removal of the duo's primary emotional stabilizer. When Dee Dee died, the entity known as Dee Dee and Damian Dame effectively ceased to exist as a biological and creative organism. The audit of this moment shows a vocal infrastructure suddenly collapsed. Damian was left to navigate the high-pressure vacuum of the industry without the mentor and partner who had first pushed him toward the microphone. In the immediate aftermath, the industry moved with its characteristic, cold velocity. The charts continued to rotate, and new artists filled the space she had occupied. However, for those within the LaFace ecosystem, the accident served as a grim reminder of the fragility of the first act. Following Dee Dee's death, Damian entered a period of profound, structural isolation. He was an architect who had lost his primary frequency. The audit of his life between 1,994 and 1,996 reveals a man attempting to finish a narrative that had been cut in half. He moved away from the increasingly corporate LaFace infrastructure, seeking to reclaim his solo voice and honor the memory of the woman he had lost. He worked with a sense of clinical urgency, as if he knew the window of his own viability was closing. Damian eventually completed a solo project, appropriately titled Damian, released independently in 1996. The album was a sonic tribute to Dee Dee, a final attempt to resolve the harmonic chords they had started together. However, the forensic timeline shows that even as the music was being manufactured for release, Damian's own biological system was in a state of terminal collapse. On the 27th of June 1996, exactly 2 years to the day after Dee Dee's fatal accident, Damian Dame died following a battle with colon cancer. He was only 29 years old. The symmetry of these dates, the 27th of June 1994 and the 27th of June 1996, serves as a permanent redaction marker in R&B history. To audit this coincidence is to confront a cruel mathematical irony. The duo that began as the flagship for a new empire was erased in 2 perfectly timed strikes, ensuring that no reunion, no retrospective interview, and no late-career comeback could ever occur to contextualize their impact. The final silence was absolute. The internal data of the industry rarely shows such a precise termination of a group's timeline. The aftermath of their deaths was further contaminated by the media contamination of the 1,990 seconds. In the absence of a loud, corporate-sponsored tribute, the public vacuum was filled with toxic speculation. Because the world could not process the random cruelty of a car accident and a terminal illness occurring on the same date, they began to manufacture scandalous logic. Stories regarding substance abuse, domestic friction, and the burgeoning AIDS crisis were whispered through the tabloid networks, attempting to find a sensational explanation for why these 2 young artists were gone. The forensic audit of the medical and investigative reports, however, points to a much simpler and more tragic reality: the random violence of an accident and the internal treachery of an aggressive illness. There were no dark secrets, only the fragility of the human instrument. The double redaction was not an act of industry conspiracy, but a devastating alignment of fate that struck twice at the heart of the LaFace Foundation. By the time the rumors faded, the names Dee Dee and Damian Dame had been largely scrubbed from the mainstream narrative, leaving only the clinical data of their hits and the haunting silence of what might have been. In the final audit of a life, we often look for a resolution, a closing chord that justifies the journey. But the story of Dee Dee and Damian Dame ends with a resonance that exists outside of the traditional industry spotlight. Their final silence is not a void. It is a clinical testament to the integrity of the sound they built. When we examine the cultural footprint they left behind, we see that they were never just a marketing experiment for LaFace Records. They were the architects of a specific frequency that bridged the gap between the analog past and the digital future of R&B. The forensic conclusion of their legacy reveals that while their names may have been redacted from the mainstream Hall of Fame narratives, their music, specifically Right Down to It, remains structurally sound. It is a song that continues to be sampled, covered, and analyzed by vocalists who recognize the vocal lock-in that Dee Dee and Damian achieved. Their influence is a submerged legacy, a foundation that supports the modern R&B aesthetic without always demanding credit from the machines that currently dominate the airwaves. The audit of their brief career offers a powerful counter-narrative to the disposable star culture of the 1,990 seconds. They proved that it was possible to create hits that were built on the balance of seasoned experience and youthful innovation. Dee Dee's Stone provided the emotional weight, while Damian's architecture provided the rhythmic precision. Together, they created a sound that didn't scream for attention, but waited for the listener to meet it halfway. They were the inaugural act of an empire, and though the empire grew too large to protect them, it could never fully erase the quality of the stone they laid down. Today, Dee Dee and Damian Dame exist in the liner notes of history. They are the missing data in the story of the LaFace dynasty. While the label went on to define the sound of a decade with global icons, the architects of the original blueprint were left in the archives. There are no biopics or documentaries dedicated to their journey, but their presence remains in the quiet storm frequency of late-night radio. Every time an R&B DJ spins their records, the audit begins anew. Listeners are still moved by the honesty of their delivery, and they are still comforted by the sincerity of their interplay. The final verdict of this audit is a recognition of interrupted brilliance. They survived the predatory politics of the industry, only to be claimed by the unpredictable mechanics of fate. As we close this file, we acknowledge that while their names were struck twice by the hand of tragedy on June 27, the frequency they established remains unbreakable. They were the first to prove that the LaFace vision could work, and for that, their legacy is permanent. They were here, they were honest, and in the silence between the beats, their echo remains solid, real, and forever right down to it.